Hello guys, what I'm looking at today is Firefly rendering. Now there are two primary types of renderers in Poser and you can choose between them in render settings. The most recent type of renderer is Superfly, and the legacy renderer, that's to say the renderer that's been around forever, is Firefly. What's the difference between them? Well, Firefly is what's known as a biased renderer. That means that when it's rendering, it's not using the calculations of actual physics to do the ray tracing. They both do ray tracing. Ray tracing is when the renderer uses the paths of the ray paths reaching your eye and traces them back to the various objects in the scene to create fairly accurate lighting and textures. But the difference between Superfly and Firefly, Superfly uses material construction which is based on real-world physics. That is to say, the properties of the actual materials. For example, if you think of a glass of water with a spoon in it, the light is deflected or refracted, and it makes the spoon look like it bends as it goes into the glass of water. Or another thing with say thick glass is it can have it kind of looks like interference in it. It's called caustics. And Superfly is an unbiased renderer, which means that it creates those effects true to real physics. And Firefly, much older, is a renderer that just kind of simulates those things rather than actually recreates them according to the rules of physics. So when we go to Firefly, there's two areas. There's the auto settings, which might be where you first started off, or there's the manual settings. Now, the auto settings, this slider determines the quality, and as you can see here, there's certain things like when the slider reaches this point here, then it's casting shadows. When it reaches this point, the ray tracing is turned on, and irradiance caching, and then the number of bounces increases as you go towards the end, and then this is the absolute best quality. But did you know that if you go to manual, you can do acquire from auto, and these settings will automatically pick up the level that you had in auto. Also, there are presets here, and if you do load preset, the default value here enables you to just go with the defaults that Bondware thought would be most useful for you. So let's have a look at this scene. So this scene has 4 characters, a little bird, a hiding, whatever that is, leopard, and a whole bunch of plants across a photographic cyclorama background. So quite a bit going on here. Now, look what happens if I render that. So it's rendering just to the view size. If I render that to Superfly, and I say render that at high quality using the optics, that's my graphics card renderer, and that will take somewhere less than 30 seconds. So here we go. Okay, I could get stopwatch out, but I'm going to use the log to check the time. The log is not entirely accurate. It's usually a few seconds slower than the actual time taken, but it's near enough for the sake of this example. And there you go. So that's rendered at high quality. And just to check the time, let's go to Window. And there's the log window. Let's just open that up. And right down at the bottom, rendering time 18.7 seconds. Okay, now let's go to our Firefly renderer. This is going to be a bit darker. The lighting's not really created for Firefly. And I'll leave this on the default. Actually, I won't. Look, if I do oh, there we go. Sorry, default. And by default, it turns on subsurface, but turns off indirect lighting. And if I render this, I imagine it's going to take a minute or so. So with the right settings, you can get Firefly to render almost as quickly as Superfly, but not at the same quality. So the purpose of this video is just to show, so that's doing the subsurface pass there. There's actually no subsurface figures in this scene, I don't think, although it appears to have shown that. Subsurface is a way of modeling textures, particularly skin or things like milk or porcelain. And what it does is it simulates the way that light penetrates slightly below the surface. So if you look at the skin of your hand right now, you can probably see veins on the back of your hand. So even though you've got the surface color of your skin, the light's penetrated all the way through the epidermis to the veins, and you're seeing the color of the veins underneath. And that basically what that does is it scatters the light. The light doesn't bounce straight back to your eye. It kind of bounces around inside your skin or inside a liquid such as milk, and it gives a much softer kind of look to the material that kind of makes it look more realistic. But as you saw there, that subsurface, there's an extra pass there. Let's have a look at how long that took to do. That wasn't too long actually. 21.7 with a subsurface pass, so that was really quite good compared to 18.7 seconds. Now, I'm not actually going to demonstrate this, but if I go back in, and the reason I'll explain in a second, if I go in here and do ultra ray trace subsurface, so that is roughly the equivalent of the Superfly render that we did before. The really important addition is this indirect light setting is now activated. So what is indirect light? Indirect light is the way that light, as it sounds, it doesn't bounce directly back from the surface, but other surfaces in the scene, light bounces off them and illuminates other parts of the scene. So this under the arm here, the light's probably bouncing off his ribs there and then on the inside of the arm. And what it does is it creates a softer, more natural look with less harsh shadows, basically. And if also a bit more vibrant. So if we compare the Superfly, so look at this shadow, for example, or down the inside of the arm here. And now let's compare that. Oh, that's not comparing very well. Why is that not comparing? Okay, that's weird. There we go. See how much more vibrant that is in Superfly, and look at the light on the inside of the armpit here. So that's indirect light or indirect illumination causing that, among other things. The Superfly render is a better renderer as well. But many of you I know will prefer using Firefly, and there is one really good reason for using Firefly, and that's that if you have a library of content going back 5-10 years, almost all of your content will have been created for the Firefly renderer. So if I look here at some of my materials and I look at, say, Victoria materials here, you'll see here almost all of these skin textures are Firefly textures. There are very few that are designed for Superfly. And why does that matter? Well, the reason is that in Superfly, Firefly textures don't render completely properly. Now, I'm very grateful to Bondware for continuing to work on this in version 13. Up until, I'm going to say, a year or so ago, what would happen is that you would render a material in Superfly and it would just look awful. And so you'd need to use a program such as Snarly Gribbly's Easy Skin or Ken 1171's Skin Edit to convert the skin to take down the brightness. Basically, everything was too glossy because Superfly interprets gloss in a different way that makes it much, much shinier for the same value. So you'd put your Firefly textures in. Oops, daisy. Stupid boy. Oh, this. So this snapped to the window. What I should have done was set this so that it could not drag dock, and now it won't snap to there. But if I go into here and look at one of these textures, they will have well, we'll do it one of the characters in the scene. We'll say torso here, and the torso texture here, here's the diffuse color, but it's down here where you have blend nodes, for example, or gloss nodes or something like that plugged into the alt specular that will create textures which are far too shiny. So you might not have the skill or the time or the interest in converting your scenes to Superfly, even though the end result is so much worth it, as you can see. But supposing you're working on a comic, for example, and you could have invested years doing earlier frames. You can't switch renderers midway through because the appearance will be considerably different. So let's go back to the render settings, and we can at least make these a little bit faster. So there are three main areas where speed is lost in the render settings here, and then one in the preferences. So we have subsurface scattering, which, as you saw, didn't really cost a lot, but if you don't need it, if you have no subsurface textures in your scene, then why have that extra pass? It doesn't make the scene worse if you have it on, but it just slows the scene down slightly. Now, ray tracing, you can turn it off, but then you're going to pay a horrible price in terms of quality. But this one, indirect light, so the time penalty you pay for using that, even though the end results are worth it, are so high that if you were doing an animation, you absolutely, even with a super powerful processor, couldn't afford to have that turned on. So Firefly and Superfly use, not only are they two different rendering engines, but Firefly uses the CPU, that's the central processor, to do all of the rendering, whereas Superfly, you have the choice. If you go up here to options, you'll see I'm using GeForce RTX 3090, that's my graphics card, and I'm using the optics renderer for it. Or I could use the standard NVIDIA GeForce, or I could use the Threadripper, which is my CPU. Now, unless you've got a 96 core Threadripper and running a 190 threads, there's no way that your CPU is going to be faster unless you have a really awful graphics card. So I believe the most common graphics card, according to the Steam survey, is still the NVIDIA GeForce. What is it? The GT 1080 or the 1080i. So basically, each generation of graphics cards is identified by this first number, which tells you the family, and then the third three numbers tell you the power within the family. So, for example, the RTX 3090 is the 30 series, and there are, let me see, probably starts with 3050 or 3060, then it goes 3070, maybe 3070 Ti, 3080, 80 Ti, 90 and 90 Ti. So this is the second highest in the 30 series, which there have been probably a dozen series over the years, but really we count them from the 1000 series. The 1000 series didn't have ray tracing, but then from then on, the RTX 20 has ray tracing, the 30 has ray tracing, and the extremely expensive 40 series also has ray tracing. But even if you have a 1080 or a 1070, you can still use this one up here, just the graphics card version without the optics driver. And this will undoubtedly be orders of magnitude faster than your processor. And the reason is that NVIDIA uses an architecture called CUDA, C-U-D-A, and CUDA are discrete rendering cores. And on my card, there's something like 10,000 rendering cores. And even on the 1080, I don't know how many thousand there are, but there's at least 1,000 probably. And each of those handles a render process. Now compare that to your CPU, which possibly has 4 cores, 8 cores. This core is 24 cores, so it's on the high end of things. And then you have to consider the CPU speed as well. So this CPU, I think, runs at maybe 3.8, 4.2 gigahertz. And there are much faster CPUs, but they don't have enough cores really. So if you have the choice of using your graphics card, then that's always preferable. But in Firefly, you don't have that option. Firefly is CPU only. So if you are doing an animation, it really behooves you, unless you've got a very good reason to stick with Firefly, to switch to Superfly. You'll only have to pay the learning cost once, and it really isn't that difficult. In fact, I've even done videos on how to convert the textures across. And as I said, if you're a bit concerned about converting the skins over, you can use Skin Edit from Ken 11, which is sold at the Bondware store and the Poser store for about $15, and it will do the conversions for you. You may have to convert some of the other stuff, but really Skin is the main area where there will be a problem. So Indirect Light, if I have Indirect Light turned on, I think we established that this scene takes about 20 seconds to render with Indirect Light off. If I turn that on, it then does an indirect light pass, and that will add anything from 20 minutes to several hours, even to this scene with my reasonably powerful processor. So the cost you pay for that is incredibly high. So what I would do is I'd set my scene up, do all of the test renders without that turned on, and then only turn that on for the final render, then go and watch a movie or two while it does it, because it's going to be very, very expensive. Also, we have this pixel sample slider. This one's not quite so expensive, but what that determines is the number of samples that are used in working out the anti-aliasing. So by default here it's set to 3, so that's a 3x3 grid, and what it does is it gives a much more softer edge on areas of high contrast. So rather than having that very sharp, jaggy look that you sometimes get with computer graphics, this softens it down, and the more pixels that you consider, the slower the render. And then the final thing is the minimum shading rate. So the shading rate, it determines, well, it basically determines the quality. You could think of it as resolution, but really it's a bit more than that. What it does is it subdivides each pixel in the screen into virtual pixels in its own memory, and the lower this number gets, the finer the detail becomes. So the default here is kind of okay. For my high quality stuff, I used to render at 0.2, which was the minimum that makes any difference, but it's one of those things you'll have to suck and see. So if you leave that on 0.95 for your tests, and then decrease it when you come to your final image. Obviously, if you're only rendering a single image, then you can really afford the cost. You know, I remember the good old days when I'd render even a 1080p image, so that would be a resolution of 1080 by 720, and that would take all night literally. 4 hours, 8 hours to render. Nowadays, not quite so bad, but if you have an image that has a lot of transparency, hair, for example, which is transparency layered on transparency, a lot of reflective or liquid objects, the time can shoot right up, and the more light you have, the worse penalty you'll pay for indirect light. So that tells you how to use this to increase your speed. There's one final way that you can make your renders a little bit quicker, and that's to go into Preferences, Render, and it's this setting which is texture caching. Now, if you're creating a scene which is a bit complicated, so it might require you to work over several sessions, so you don't leave it loaded. You save and exit poser, and then the next time you come back and you continue. If this value is 0, so textures are not cached, what happens is every time you reload your scene, the first time you render, the textures load into memory, and then they are processed, ready to do whatever they're going to do. So there is some kind of background processing, and then the scene is rendered with those textures. However, by default, this value of 1000 megabytes, so that's just under a gigabyte, or a decimal gigabyte, is how much is set aside for texture caches. So if I close the program now and then reload it, those textures will still be stored in the cache on a hard drive, and the location is where's the texture cache? I can't remember where the texture cache is actually. Possibly down here in the temp files, but wherever the texture cache is, you ideally want that to be a faster drive, so an NVMe drive or an SSD rather than a physical hard drive, because with this turned to a decently large amount, and as you can see here, this scene is actually using 1376, apparently, I think that's what that means, 1376 megabytes of texture. So there's a number of things going on here, so perhaps I might turn that up to 1500, 1.5 gigs. I'm actually quite surprised because it's complicated, but there's a lot of repetition going on here. It's the same skin texture on all 4 of these, the same on the loincloths. The plants are using the same texture, so I'm quite surprised that that's, in fact, I would go so far as to say I don't believe that number. But anyway, there's a few things there, guys, to help you speed up your Firefly renders. I really do strongly recommend that if you can bear to do so, and you're not midway through a long project that needs consistency from one render to another, that you switch to Superfly. Even if you're a lifelong Firefly person, the benefits are just so great that it just make the change and you'll be happy you did in the long term. Okay, guys, well, of course, if you can't bear to change, if you're doing a project that needs consistency, the other solution is to get a faster CPU. So I speak to people who've got CPUs that are 10 years old, and the average for people is supposedly every 3 years you should upgrade your PC to get the same feel of performance as you had when it was new, because programs advance and become more demanding. And 10 years is an awfully long time, and you might be thinking, well, I'm getting by. I'm used to waiting all night for one render. But why wait all night if you can wait 10 minutes or 5 minutes or even half an hour, So a new Intel CPU might be a good idea. Now, the latest Intel CPUs, I gather, are going to get rid of hyperthreading. And hyperthreading, if I go up to here in the general preferences, you will see in the render, there's a thing here called number of threads. And hyperthreading is a way of dividing your CPU so that each core, so my CPU has 24 cores, but each core does splits into 2, and each core then is considered to be a thread, and each thread can do a separate workload. So there's 48 different threads all working to render in Firefly. That doesn't apply, by the way, if you're using a graphics card, GPU renderer, because that doesn't have threads. It just they're all single threaded, if you like, but there's so many of them that it doesn't matter. So what CPU, whatever CPU you have, just make sure that the number of threads is turned to maximum, and then at least you'll get the best out of the CPU. And yeah, there's a consideration between the speed of your CPU in gigahertz and the number of threads that the CPU has. But I think the sweet spot is somewhere around about 16 with hyperthreading. But we'll have to wait and see what the new processors from Intel are like. Okay, guys, hopefully that gives you some ideas, you Firefly people, and I will speak to you again soon.